Gary Meacher. I'm assistant professor of design at Quincy University. And today I figured I'd share some of my experiences of teaching design in, I don't even know, 10, 15 years or so worth of experience. In design, I teach through critique quite often, so I figured I'd share some of the things I've learned about critique and feedback. So first up, we have really just the conversation of what critique and feedback are. Initially, you might think that they're the same thing. I like to think of critique as feedback for a specific item or thing, something that you're working on, whereas feedback is something that you give to a person. So if we want to talk about the purpose and the value of a critique, the idea here is that we're trying to improve the work, right? That's the goal. We're criticizing this document, this research plan, this art project, this design, and we're trying to make the work better. And so we want to focus on the fact that critique serves the work, not necessarily the person who made the work. So yes, it helps the person who made the work perform better, but we're not critiquing the person, we're critiquing the work itself, which is really the main emphasis here, which is that critique is not on your humanity. If you make bad work or you end up doing something that's wrong or incorrect, it doesn't make you a bad person. We're critiquing the work itself. So I think it's an important sort of mental health separation. Separate yourself from your work. You're not a bad person if what you made ends up not working out. The work itself could be better. So when we get into critique, we want to talk about the way that interaction happens between the person giving the critique, the person who's working on the specific item or the research or the art. And ideally, that person walks away from that critique feeling empowered or excited to make better work, right? Hopefully they don't walk away feeling defeated or just miserable about the experience. It's not always a great feeling to have someone say, oh, this thing that you spent all this time doing didn't turn out so well. But ideally, you've given enough feedback that you feel empowered to progress and make it better. So that dynamic can only happen when both the giver and the receiver of the critique understands that dynamic. So we're going to talk about how to give feedback and how to give criticism. Oftentimes you learn as much from critique, giving someone a critique, as you do as getting one. Sometimes you see mistakes that other people are making, and you internalize the fact that, well, I should not do that. And I've been talking mostly about mistakes so far. Critique is not only about mistakes. Critique is also about reassuring that what you've done is good, and it's a good direction, and you should continue to do it. So you can learn from people's successes, and you can learn from people's failures. So you want to pay close attention to critiques of other people's work. So if you're in a group environment or a group dynamic, you would learn a bit from watching someone else critique someone else's work. You can see that dynamic, you learn from each other. And in a group setting, especially for me with my experience in the classroom, students learn from each other via critique, learn from other failures. They learn not to do what John Doe did, right? They learn to learn from other people's failures as well. And most importantly, it's beyond your own work, right? It's not just what everyone else is doing. We can learn from criticism on all levels. So specific to feedback, I think feedback, if we try to define it a bit, the goal is it's a level of communication meant to advance or improve something, right? So we're giving feedback to someone. And it's best when it's an open and active dialogue. It's not so great if you open up an email and it says, here's all the things you did wrong, do it better. It's better if it's a back and forth and a discussion. So one of the most important things to understand about feedback is that it includes both positive and negative. And so for example, people, when you ask them like what kind of feedback they'd like to get, in a very honest setting, they would say like, hey, I just want to know what's real. I just want to know what I did well. And if I'm terrible at something, tell me, because I need to be better, right? So people are open and ready to hear the negative feedback. So you want to think about in your own personal life, the person who's had the biggest impact for you. And you'd be surprised, oftentimes that person is the person who's had the courage to give you tough feedback in that moment. You needed to hear it. That person wasn't afraid to tell you that one thing you needed to hear. And so if you think back in your personal life, there's probably a person or two that comes to mind that really set you on a different path because they had the courage to tell you there was something you could do better. And really our goal with all of this is to grow and improve, right? So we want to think about, personally, we can critique ourselves a little bit, but there's always going to be blind spots. And so we want to think about that ability to shine light on things that we can't see about ourselves. And that's where feedback and critique is incredibly valuable, right? We all have our own blind spots. So in some ways, it's not what you say, but how you say it, which is really what I want to focus on. And hopefully that's kind of the meat of this conversation that you walk away with, which is how to give someone feedback. So how you say it is a big part. And it takes a real effect on people. So for example, you've probably had this experience where someone said something positive, something negative, and then something positive, right? We sort of call that the feedback sandwich. So you have something to say to someone, like something very uncomfortable, and you say, well, I'm going to come up with something nice to say so that this interaction starts out smooth. And then I'm going to give them the real meat, which is the thing that I want them to know, which is oftentimes negative, or at least uncomfortable. And then I'm going to wrap up that conversation with something positive so that I don't have an awkward ending to that interaction, right? And so this form of feedback is actually awful. It is arguably the worst kind of feedback. And so you might be thinking, well, I've been doing this my whole life. Everyone has always told me, like, give them the positive, negative, positive, wrap it in a nice package so that they accept it a little more. Really, it's deceiving, and it sets up a mood of distrust between that interaction between you and that person. You as the person who wants to give them feedback, you have this moment where it's like, I want to tell them something real, but I'm afraid to hurt their feelings, right? So you make up something, and so you're starting right away in that interaction in a negative way by making something up. It's deceitful, and really you're not getting right to the point, which we said before. When you ask people what they want to hear, they just want to hear what's real. So let's get past the fake sort of feedback and get right to the point. So how do we do that? If we think about this grid here, so don't freak out if you're not a math person. We've got a bit of a grid to focus on here. We have a scale. We're going from specific to general, and then from negative to positive, okay? And so we have this kind of range that feedback can, like a spectrum, that feedback can fall onto. So for example, in this upper area, so this would be positive general feedback, okay? So if you're to give someone generally positive feedback, that would be things like, we'll talk about that in a moment. We're also talking about positive specific feedback, and then general negative feedback, and then specific negative feedback. So those are the 4 quadrants, okay? So 4 different versions of feedback, they fall within this spectrum. So if we want to get into some specifics, that would be general positive. You just tell someone, hey, nice job. Okay. I guess you could say that's feedback. You told someone nice job. So that is generally positive, right? Excuse me. You can also say, hey, that's cool. Or give them a high five, right? Like those are generally positive things that happen in response to something that you've done. But I want you to hold on to that for a moment as we continue to think about some of these other types of feedback. So if we get into general negative, you might say, hey, you could have done better on that. There was opportunity there and you missed it. You could have done better. You suck, just straight up, like, hey, this was awful, right? You could have done better. I can't believe you did that, right? Like, it's just a general kind of vague. You might even redefine the word general as vague in this sense. It's just a vaguely negative statement. And so what happens when we compare those two is there's hits of emotion. So if I come up to you and say, hey, great job. First of all, for you, you're thinking, wow, I did a great job. Like you have this dopamine excitement hit to your ego. And you're like, all right, awesome, I did a good job. And you're sort of happy for a bit. Whereas the opposite side, obviously, is a hit to that ego, right? And you're just like, wow, I did awful. And you kind of feel like garbage for a while after you get that kind of feedback. And so what we want to think about in terms of feedback and affecting our future, which is, remember, we talked about the intent, which is improvement. So when I think back, like next time I go to write this report, and I'm writing a new report, and I think to myself, well, last time I wrote a report, they told me I did a good job. So what do I learn from that moment? Which is really nothing, because I was not told anything specific that I did well. So I'm just gonna, I guess, do everything exactly as I did before, and hopefully I get another good job. And possibly even worse is the general negative, because not only did I do an awful job and I have that awful moment, but I also have absolutely no knowledge of how I can be better, right? I'm starting that next research paper, and I was told last time I was awful, and I don't know what I did that was awful, or what should I stop doing? What can I do better, right? So it's long-lasting negative effects when you actually get very vague, general negative feedback. And I would argue that positive, vague, general feedback is also ultimately quite negative. It doesn't actually help you in any way. Now, if we think about generally positive, that could be something like, specific positive, that could be something like, great job, that PowerPoint, you had the perfect pacing, right? You did an awesome job on that PowerPoint. It had the right timing and the perfect pace, like I was into it, I was engaged in it. So that's a very specific thing that I can take with me and move forward to make a better presentation next time. Or awesome use of color on that report. It really helped me see the details, right? And so I know now that maybe I have a strong understanding of use of color, and when I go to do a report, I can rely on that skill, and I know that I'm strong in that because someone gave me specific feedback about that. If we flip that to the other side, negative and specific, for example, that song you used wasn't the best because it was too energetic at the wrong time. So, you have some kind of presentation with music in the background, and it was just like conflicting your message. So now moving forward, when I'm thinking about my song choice for something like this, I need to think about the mood and the tone of the content, right? So I have specific goals that I can make better. Or that graphic you used in your PowerPoint was hard to read. It was too detailed for a presentation. I couldn't see it. It was just like way too much stuff going on. So again, now I know I need to simplify my graphics next time I go to do this. So one more on the negative side. Your explanation was lacking. I would have liked to see some examples. Right? You know what to do. You can take that information, internalize it, and make your next step better. So we have this main focus here on the left side, specific positive and specific negative. And I would argue that we initially might say negative is rough and like it's not great, doesn't make you feel good, but specific negative feedback is actually something that you can build on. And both of these are extremely helpful to build on improvement, right? That's our goal with feedback. So focus on that left side, focus on specific feedback as much as possible. So we want to talk about maybe how to give feedback. So we say specific versus general, but now how do we actually do it? There's this model called stop, keep, and start. I believe it was developed by a professor, so Brigham Young University. I don't recall his name off the top of my head, but he says, let's try this stop, keep, start, which is SKS. And so what should I stop doing? What should I keep doing? And what should I start doing? So let's think about that for a moment. This is me asking for feedback, right? So me as a person asking you for feedback. You just watched me do something, you read something I wrote, you used something I made, you looked at something I created, and I want to ask you, what should I stop doing, right? There's something I'm doing that you don't think I should keep doing, right? And then there's something I should keep doing. So in other words, what am I doing well that I should not lose? I need to hold on to this. It's something I'm good at. And then what should I start doing? There's something it's not even on my radar that I need to be aware of that I should start doing. And if I can get answers to those questions, I can build a much better product moving forward. We have another one, and this is the other side of this, which is how to give someone feedback. So we can itemize this by situation, behavior, and impact. So for example, I'm talking to you, I'm giving you feedback. We had an interaction recently, and I want to give you feedback about it. What I want to do is identify the situation. So I might say, hey, yesterday at that meeting, right? So I've identified the situation, right? And then I can describe the behavior. So I could say, yesterday at that meeting, you gave a presentation. And during that presentation, it seemed like you weren't quite confident in some of the facts you were presenting. Some of the figures seemed wrong, and you had the wrong numbers in your slide. And you showed up a few minutes late. You kind of didn't come prepared for the presentation, right? So I've defined the situation, and I've defined the behavior. And then next we have the impact. So if I wrap this all together, I would say, yesterday at the meeting, you showed up a little bit late. Some of your slides were wrong. You weren't terribly confident in the information you were presenting. And I sort of left the meeting embarrassed, and I'm worried about how you might have affected our department's credibility, right? So I've explained, this is me giving you feedback. I told you when and where it happened, what you did, and how it's impacting me and everyone else. So I have a very clear picture of what happened and how it's affecting people, right? So I think this is the best way to give complete feedback. The details are important, the situation is important, and the impact is very important. So I want to end with a few tips that I think are valuable. So for example here, we talk about feedback. Feedback, possibly one of the greatest lessons I've learned in my life so far is that we should always assume positive intent. If we can assume positive intent in all of our interactions, and this is just like being a decent human being, this is not just giving feedback, this is not being a teacher or a student or a coworker, this is just being a human being. If you can assume that other people are trying to be positive or they're trying their best, not only are you going to live a bit of a happier life, but those interactions are going to be much more successful. They'll be more fruitful. They're going to walk away with these interactions better. So you see someone doing something wrong, and you have to tell yourself, they're not doing this on purpose. They probably think what they're doing is right. Like, what's happening? Why did they choose to do that? Why did that happen? How did they land at this decision? No one sets out to do something wrong, right? Even as a teacher, and I deal with quote unquote judging people and what they do quite often, and scoring people's performances, right? I need to remind myself that when someone turns in F work, right, like just awful work, they didn't sit down and say, I'm gonna do F level work, right? They don't sit down and do that. They just happen to not be equipped to do it well. They made the wrong choice. They were confused, there was a miscommunication, something happened. And so if we can assume positive intent in these interactions, we're gonna be much happier for it. I would also encourage you to ask for permission to speak to someone. So if you have feedback to give to them, you want to keep in mind that people are not always in the mood to talk. So this might sound kind of weird and maybe cheesy, but you could say, hey John, I wanted to talk to you about what happened yesterday at the meeting. Do you have time? And they might be in a crappy mood and they just say, no, like not right now, I can't handle it. Or they say, okay, cool, like let's chat about it. They're ready to go. Or you can say like, hey, I want to talk to you about this thing that happened yesterday. Are you around? Are you available? And they'll say no. Say, okay, well, how about like 2 o'clock? Does that work? And so you give them the freedom to set the stage to hear this feedback. And they can say yes or no, and they can suggest other times. But the idea is that this interaction is happening on their terms, and they're open to it, and they're ready to hear it, right? So you want to ask for permission to talk to someone about something specific, especially when it comes to giving feedback. And one of the most important things to communicate is the why, right? We talked about the situation, the behavior, and the impact. So if we can think about why this happened, or what you did, or what situation got us there, and then what effect it had, that's really the key. Why and the effect. Why are you upset, or why did you think it was wrong, and what the effect is when you give that feedback. And remember, we said before, this only works when we work together. So finding a solution together, it should be never a one-way conversation. You're not coming at someone and saying, you did this, this, and this, fix it, and then you leave, right? Like, that's not how it works. You, as the person giving the feedback, you might want to know how they got to this point so that you can fix that from happening in the future. You know, maybe you're a manager and you work with multiple employees, and you want to know how that employee landed on this decision, which ended up being wrong in your eyes. So you want to fix that for future employees. Or, you know, or the other way around. You want to make sure that whoever's judging you or critiquing you or you know, assessing your work performance in any way, you want them to know how you got to that solution or how you got to this stage in the project, and know how you got there and know that it was worthwhile. So they might think it's wrong, but you think it's right, and you have this nice back and forth conversation. So again, it's never a one-way thing. And then at the end, you know, I think it's worthwhile to thank the person for their time. Like, hey, thanks, John, for listening to me. You know, I know you had a rough presentation yesterday, but thanks for taking the time to hear me out. It's important to me that you heard my thoughts. And, you know, whether they wanted to hear it or not, or they're happy with what you had to say, you know, there's an immediate discomfort, especially if it was negative feedback. But then I would encourage you to follow up. And this is where the rubber really hits the road. This is proof of concept. You know, next time John gives a presentation, and you notice that he heard you, right? He heard the feedback that you gave them, and he made a very clear effort to fix those problems from last time. And you gotta follow up with John and say, hey, I noticed in this week's presentation, after the feedback we had, you did a great job, you know, fixing up that PowerPoint, and you were very clear on the data, and you came right on time, and everybody was ready. I appreciate that you heard me, right? So not only do you feel heard and you have a great conversation, a nice relationship with your coworker or student or significant other or anyone that you're giving feedback with, but that person also has the really long-lasting dopamine hit of, I worked at something and I was better at it, and now I'm better, right? And that's a huge moment. So I would encourage you to reach out if you like. It's my contact info there on the screen. And, you know, don't forget to give me very specific feedback. I'd love to hear it. Thanks for watching.